Tom Joad got out of the old McAllister pen. There he got his parole. After 4 long years on a man-killing charge, Tom Joad come walking down the road, poor boy. Tom Joad come walking down the road.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm honored today to talk about one of the greatest authors in American literature, John Steinbeck. Let me just start with a little story. The first time I was exposed to one of the works of John Steinbeck was in high school. I was struggling with one of his works entitled The Pearl. I was reading basically 1 page a day in high school. Of course, with the help of the dictionary, I was able to finish the entire work, and I was fascinated by his style of writing as well as his thematic concerns. Now, when I came to France, when I joined the Department of English, I wanted to read more, and in fact I started to develop a certain kind of interest in comparative literature. So what I'm going to present today is part of the things I was thinking about a long time ago. My name is Hamid Mountassir. My areas of research, in fact, are post-colonial theory and cultural studies, but comparative literature is also part of my academic concerns. I've been trying to contribute certain things when it comes to comparative literature, trying to build bridges between cultures, and I always find some American authors and also some European authors as good examples of a kind of cultural interaction, if we can talk about the Arab world and the West. Well, today I'm not going to introduce, of course, John Steinbeck. You know the man. I'm going to talk about his legacy, more or less, which can manifest itself in some of the writings of certain Arab authors. I just want to clarify the concept of legacy as we understand it in the Arab world, at least. When we talk about contemporary, for example, contemporary Arab fiction, we can always go back to Najib Mahfouz as the legacy in the Arab world. He's the model when it comes to writing short fiction or perhaps novels, but we can also go beyond the boundaries of the Arab world to find other forms of cultural legacies. Let me perhaps ask you a question about, and I'm sorry, perhaps the can you identify these titles here? Good. And if I can ask you about one of your favorite titles by John Steinbeck. Yes,
Of Mice and Men.
Of Mice and Man.
George and Letty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, please.
East of Eden.
East of Eden. Right. Good. That's a good choice. Grapes of Wrath. Good. Which works perhaps do you think are most commonly read in the Arab world? Of course, either in English or perhaps through Arabic translation. Can you just guess?
Yes.
Grapes of Wrath.
Of Mice and Men.
And also of Mice and Men. Right. I will be talking about this later on. But as you can notice, I mean, if you look at this list, this is a man. Some of the titles, by the way, relate to travel literature. As you know, John Steinbeck was always on the move. Not only he was based in California, but he was visiting other states, and he also went on a trip the former Soviet Union. And that's why you can see here a Russian journal, This is the outcome of his trip to Russia. So this is in fact a man who was not just sitting at a desk to produce fiction. He was trying to experience life as it is. And I guess this is one aspect of his legacy in the Arab world, which I'm going to relate to some Arab authors. Now, to talk about John Steinbeck is also to raise this issue, American studies in the Arab world. To what extent, perhaps, or are we in a better position, perhaps, were we in a better position in the past and even today to understand the United States as a society in the Arab world and its culture and its literature? Now, the truth is that throughout the Arab world, of course, we are interested in American studies, but we don't have specialized centers or research centers on American studies. What we have instead, English departments which can design syllabi in which works of American literature can be integrated, as a matter of fact. But a number of intellectuals, especially Arab intellectuals after the Second World War, had the chance to get to the West for their education, and most of them graduated from American universities and European universities, and this is how works in American literature were integrated in the Arab world. This is how, of course, American literature and aspects of American society were introduced in the Arab world. There are other forms of, let's say, introducing American literature and culture through movies and music as well. But I guess fiction was American fiction, the introduction of American fiction in the Arab world, its pace was very slow. And I just want to clarify that certain Arab intellectuals did in fact contribute to the growth and development of American studies. Some of them even decided to stay in their countries of origin after graduating from American universities to teach American literature or to teach American culture. Certain names have always been part of any syllabus in any English department in Morocco. If I want to talk about the case of Morocco, I don't have any perhaps idea about the other departments in the Arab world, but John Steinbeck, of course, has been always part of the syllabus. William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway. These are, if you ask Moroccan students, I guess you can easily deduce that these are the names most Moroccan students are familiar with, at least through their names, or perhaps they've already read some of their works. Now, what about reading John Steinbeck in Arabic? What about translating John Steinbeck in Arabic? What kind of translation do we have in the Arab world? I mean, this is, to be honest with you, this is a topic I was researching, and I was Googling a lot to find certain titles translated into Arabic, and of course I did find certain titles, but I just want to tell you that translators sometimes would be very selective in terms of what can be translated. The reason why translators are very selective is that sometimes the publishing industry can impose certain, let's say, constraints. And the other reason is that the Middle East crisis is also a part of it from a political perspective. So both translators and publishers can coordinate in order to choose the titles which can be translated from American literature. But anyway, the name of John Steinbeck has been always on lists of translation. He has been favored all the time. And it's high time we paid attention to the issue of translation in the Arab world, because we don't translate a lot. If you compare the works being translated from Arabic into English, and I'm talking about fiction, short fiction perhaps, or novels, and those works translated from Western literature, and especially American literature, into Arabic, you can easily see the discrepancy between the two. We have long lists of titles translated, especially for the last 20 years, translated from Arabic into English, but we don't have much translated from English into Arabic when it comes to fiction. Now, what does this mean, translating John Steinbeck into Arabic? Now, for me, an act of translation, which is also, by the way, an act of acculturation, this interaction between different cultures, it can also be an act of rewriting John Steinbeck. What I have noticed, and I was comparing passages from certain translations I'm going to, at least the titles I'm going to show you, and the original texts, and I can understand the difficulty somehow in translating, rendering John Steinbeck into Arabic. The problem stems from the fact that in some of his works are replete with Americanisms and idiomatic expressions, and translators sometimes would opt for paraphrase more than real translation, because the speech as it is produced by John Steinbeck is not easy to render in Arabic. In terms of finding certain equivalents, and as you know, John Steinbeck's, one of his strengths was the dialogue in his fiction speech, which seems to be very authentic. Of course, the different dialects being used in California, the vernaculars which people can exploit in this area. So this is what I think of John Steinbeck being translated into Arabic, to the extent that you get editions like this, and just from their covers, maybe you would think that these editions are addressed to children. They're not. These are novels, of course, translated into Arabic. What is also interesting about these titles is that you have dual translation. You have one page in Arabic, the original text, and the other page in English. So for educational purposes, I guess teachers and instructors of Arabic can always exploit the works of John Steinbeck, the works we have translated into Arabic. To my surprise, there has been always one publishing house dominating these editions, JarirBooks.net. I mean, if you log on to the internet, I mean, you can find this publisher. I put Anaqid al-Ghadab, which is grapes of wrath in Arabic, in the middle, because as I told you, this is one of the most favorite, perhaps, books by John Steinbeck in the Arab world. When it comes to John Steinbeck and his presence in the Arab theatre, we cannot find much about his oeuvre, but there was a group in Palestine, a group of people who tried to adapt the story, The Pearl and Lu'lu'ah, to a theatrical performance. And there's nothing perhaps which I can add here, except that this play, this theatrical performance, was a great success in Palestine. So again, this is great evidence that the name of John Steinbeck can, geographically speaking, in the Arab world, the name can cross many geographical boundaries. Usually Egypt or Cairo perhaps is the place where you can find lots of cultural activities and literary events taking place. And I guess some of certain study days and conferences about John Steinbeck took place in Cairo a long time ago. But for the last 5 years, I have noticed that John Steinbeck has been also adapted to theatre, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Yes, please.
Question. I don't know, maybe you're going to get to this later, but as far as you're talking about translation of the speech, but what about how the themes translate into the Arab?
I was coming for that.
Great.
I was coming for that, and of course
yeah.
I will be talking about specific Arab authors, because as I explained at the beginning of my talk, this has always been part of my concern as a comparatist, of contemporary Arabic literature and other literatures, North American literatures and also South American literatures, in English translations, because I can't use Spanish. Now, for the last maybe 12-15 years, I've been reading lots of novels written by Arab authors, and I like to read even mainstream American literature and also mainstream British literature. And I was comparing a number of books produced by Arab authors with what John Steinbeck produced, in terms both of short fiction and his novels. And I came to, these are some of my findings, in terms of the thematic concerns, the themes you can come across in the work of both John Steinbeck and Arab authors. We have this concept, which I have borrowed from post-colonial theory, writing marginality. Now, what we mean by writing marginality here is simply to write stories about people living at the margins of society. Talking about any form of marginality in society. And of course, you can always think about these forms of marginality. Poverty is one of these forms. Homelessness and unemployment and all these elements can be integrated within this component of writing marginality. Arab authors, most of them today, can qualify as authors of marginality. I will be raising this issue in a few moments, inshallah. Authors of marginality. The other theme, which, and this is something perhaps which is quite interesting to explore in the work both of John Steinbeck and Arab authors, this notion of displacement. This does not manifest itself in one of his works, which is Grapes of Wrath, as you know, based on this journey full of hardships from Oklahoma to California, and then those challenges facing the Jodes, the family, and it's an epic, in fact, novel. The epic dimension is always there, but a number of Arab authors can also experiment with this notion of displacement. And I will be comparing John Steinbeck with Muhammad Shukri later on to talk about displacement, because what, according to John Steinbeck, I mean, what can make literature is, in fact, these notions, marginality and displacement. Literature is not meant to deal with the lives of those who have. the main concern of John Steinbeck was with those who did not have anything, those who were living at the margins of the American society. And this is a recurrent theme in contemporary Arabic literature. It has been a recurrent theme since the very beginnings of the Arabic novel, which is very recent. Poverty and disillusionment, again, these are two post-colonial notions forming the post-colonial condition. From the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf, I mean, you can find lots of Arab authors, again, talking about poverty and disillusionment. Migrant identities, again, this is one of the themes you can explore if you're interested in John Steinbeck and Arab authors. Mind you that recently migrancy has been a prominent theme in contemporary Moroccan fiction. There are so many titles referring to this issue of immigration, illegal immigration, looking for paradise in Europe, and again, once they're being disillusioned, just in the same way in the work of John Fowles, well, I was thinking about the British author John Fowles, John Steinbeck. You can find some of his characters being totally disillusioned, full of despair, and trying to impose themselves in life, and despair and the struggle to survive. This is in fact what can attract readers to the work of John Steinbeck. Well, according to some people, I mean, there's always that bleak vision which John Steinbeck wanted to construct about America at the time, during the period of economic depression and the other challenges America was facing. But I guess within this sense of despair, you have these characters struggling to come up with a new sense of life. It's despair which can be mingled with, let's say, joy at the end. So I do not want to be exhaustive in terms of these thematic issues which you can explore both in the work of John Steinbeck and in the work of some Arab authors. I'm sure that you can find other themes. Now, when it comes to matters of language and style, John Steinbeck has been always a kind of literary model for certain Arab authors, for the simple reason that in his work you have that sense of storytelling. Because today a number of Arab authors can always experiment with certain new narrative techniques. Some of these narrative techniques can be even very confusing in terms of time, yes please, time and place. Yes. Readers always look for a story in a book, and this is what you can always find in the work of John Steinbeck. And I'm not talking here about a direct influence, because again, this is something which we need to research. But I know for sure that certain Arab authors would mention, in terms of certain influences, would mention the name of John Steinbeck. A case in point here is Mohammed Shukri, the Moroccan author, who mentioned John Steinbeck in one or two interviews he gave a long time ago. So the author knew John Steinbeck through translation. I guess Mohammed Shukri was reading John Steinbeck in Spanish, and sometimes in French, but I guess in Spanish. So you have this sense of storytelling, which Arab authors inherited from Najib Mahfoud, but then he's the master of storytelling in the Arab world. But then they were trying to borrow, to experiment with other forms of storytelling. John Steinbeck, if you compare John Steinbeck with William Faulkner, you can see the difference. Even in English departments, in Moroccan universities, again, students can be easily disillusioned, stylistically speaking, with William Faulkner, given his narrative techniques and his modes of narration. Yeah, a difficult author to read, I mean, to be honest with you. But then when you give students a work by John Steinbeck, even though the work somehow can be lengthy, they can cope because you've got a solid sense of storytelling. You have at least a beginning, a middle, and an end, no matter how this end can be. But you have this chronological, perhaps, order, although John Steinbeck himself was experimenting in some of his works with time. The other dimension is characterization. In some of his works, John Steinbeck, the way he was building up his characters, and especially the fall of certain characters, the fall of the characters somehow, or a character being the embodiment of good or perhaps evil, is something again which Arab authors were trying to work on. I always mention the name of Najib Mahfoud. Again, Najib Mahfoud is the author who was using and abusing these techniques of descriptions. By the way, I mentioned the name of Najib Mahfoud a number of times, and Najib Mahfoud, as you know, started his literary career as a writer in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Roughly speaking, at the same time when John Steinbeck also started writing, late 1920s, early 1930s. If you ask me about the kind of relationship, maybe, which both authors had, what is your guess? You have a master of American literature, and then in the Arab world you have this fascinating literary figure, Najib Mahfoud, but did they know each other? No. And that's the irony. Because as I said at the beginning of my talk, translation, the pace of translation was very slow. And because of the Middle East crisis and a number of issues, these things contributed to the undermining of all these cultural relationships. It's never too late. I think we can still build bridges. We can still make contemporary Arabic literature known to a large American readership, and American perhaps translators can help us to introduce and to make American literature known to Arab readers. Speech and dialogue, and I want here to ask maybe, we have students here, right? And have you ever read something by John Steinbeck?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No, I watched the film Grapes of Wrath.
Okay, good. And what is the difference? Well, have you read the book, The Grapes of Wrath? No. Good. Let me ask you, perhaps those of you who are familiar with The Grapes of Wrath or any work by John Steinbeck, how did you find dialogue?
It's been so long since I read it, but I do remember it just being, I was just so vivid when I read it, like I could see and hear everything, but I don't really remember the specifics. I'd have to revisit.
Okay. Yes, sit up
I don't know that according to the dialogue between George and Lenny and Mice and Man, I always felt that John Steinbeck was always trying to set the scene, which means that there was always a kind of correlation between the scene and the tone of the dialogue would be kind of falling square within the scene. Like when George was talking to Lenny or Lenny talking to George, you feel, while reading the dialogue, you feel like it's really realistic. I mean, it's kind of, it strikes you as kind of really, really...
Because we're not native speakers, so it's not easy for us to assess the kind of language which was used by John Steinbeck, especially in speech and dialogue. Not native speakers, I guess, as you know, find it very difficult somehow even to teach idiomatic expressions, or perhaps to use idiomatic expressions. And what Tawfiq has just said is to the point, because John Steinbeck was always trying to render the dialogue in a very realistic way, to the extent that you feel that you're in the scene as a reader, you're participating in the dialogue. It's so authentic, so genuine. Now, the reason why John Steinbeck was producing such dialogues in his books is his experiences, personal experiences. This is an author who was living with farmers. This is a person who was a picker himself in a farm, and he could easily pick up the register or that vernacular being exploited by these farmers. And this is what I said at the beginning of my talk. You cannot sit on an armchair and just say, I'm going to write a short story perhaps, or a novel. It doesn't work this way. Now, a number of Moroccan authors, by the way, have been following this legacy, starting with Mohammed Shukri, as you know, who was just roaming the streets of Tangiers at night, and he wrote a number of his short stories and even chapters from his novels in cafes and in bars and in public places, because for him an author is not only a writer involving an act of producing, jotting notes on a piece of paper. Writing also involves a sense of observation, and this is the legacy perhaps which John Steinbeck has left in the Arab world. You have also the name Mohammed Zavzaf. It's amazing how Mohammed Zavzaf, by the way, I'm trying to mention these names because it's only Mohammed Shukri who is known to American readers through the translation of his work For Bread Alone by Paul Bowes. As for Mohammed Zavzaf, he's also a fascinating Moroccan writer in terms of dealing with those themes I was talking about: disillusionment, marginality, writing marginality, poverty, etc. Unfortunately, none of his I can't think of one single work by Mohammed Zavzaf being translated into English. You have also Dris al-Khouri. By the way, both Mohammed Zavzaf and Mohammed Shukri died 4 or 5 years ago. Dris al-Khouri, who is a member of the same generation, is still alive. He has been observing society, has been observing people in Casablanca in the same place, in the same cafe. A number of his short fiction collections were just produced in those places. So what I want to say is that when it comes to rendering speech and dialogue, you have to be part of the community. You have to feel what the community feels. Of course, this is something which John Steinbeck himself borrowed from French literature. As you know, when Émile Zola wanted to write La Terre, or perhaps Germinal, which is about miners, he decided to spend a few days with the miners underground to experience how life was underground. And then he came up with that fascinating book called Germinal, which is about the problems of miners and their strikes and also their sense of disillusionment. I would like you to contemplate with me excerpts from John Steinbeck's speech at the Nobel Banquet at the City Hall in Stockholm, and this took place in 1962. Maybe 6 years before his death. Sorry. Literature is as old as speech. It grew out of human need for it, and it has not changed except to become more needed. This is the excerpt I personally I was interested in. John Steinbeck, ladies and gentlemen, can always remind us of the need and the importance and the significance of literature in our societies. The reason why I'm saying so, because the readership of literature in the Arab world is so limited, very low. And this is a man who was addressing the, of course, an audience, talking in 1962, talking about the need for literature, the need to know life. Literature is life, and in spite of those hardships John Steinbeck himself had gone through, we should not forget that he was harassed a number of times. He was even called a communist. He was blacklisted. He was audited by the FBI a number of times on purpose, just to give him hard time. But he always he believed in what he believed, his own principles, that literature should be at the service of the poor and the marginalized. I wonder how many authors, Arab authors perhaps, can benefit from what John Steinbeck was saying about his artistic vision in terms of giving certain tips to especially young authors. Well, personally, Muhammad Shukri was using the second technique. Write freely and as rapidly as possible and throw the whole thing on paper. Never correct or rewrite until the whole thing is down. Rewrite in process is usually found to be an excuse for not going on. It also interferes with flow and rhythm, which can only come from a kind of unconscious association with the material. Muhammad Shukri himself was saying that he wrote for bread alone. In fact, when he went to approach Paul Bowes and talk to him about the possibility of translating the work, he finished the first 2 chapters in the course of 1 week, and he started talking about the translation of the work even without finishing the entire thing. But then, when Paul Bowes accepted, he immediately rushed into ending the entire manuscript. The other thing which I was talking about as far as the rendering of speech is concerned, if you are using dialogue, say it aloud as you write it. Only then will it have the sound of speech. Modern and contemporary Arabic fiction, and I think I've already mentioned some of these issues here, the novel as a new literary genre. But roughly speaking, the first Arabic novel was published at the end of the 19th century by Abdurrahman Sharqawi, the Egyptian author. It was entitled Al-Ard. But then we cannot, just ignore these 2 names, the legacy of Georges Zaidan, who was interested in rewriting Islamic history. Georges Zaidan produced a number of historical novels, and we would always call him the Walter Scott of the Arab world. And then, of course, Najib Mahfoud. Western influences, realism, naturalism, existentialism. There are so many books talking about these influences in Arabic, especially in Arabic, how these Arab authors were either influenced by Emile Zola, perhaps, or by John Steinbeck, but again, this is a component in comparative literature, as you know, and it requires lots of research. Let me just take you, please, to the list I want to talk about in relation to John Steinbeck's legacy. Najib Mahfoud and John Steinbeck have so many things in common, except that John Steinbeck was expanding his sittings, and most of his locales are outside cities, but Najib Mahfoud was always concerned with urban centers, and Cairo, as you know, was at the heart of his oeuvre, of his work. 60% of Najib Mahfoud's work revolves around novels set in Cairo. But there's an Arab author, perhaps my generation, members of my generation know, Hanna Mina, the great Syrian author, Hanna Mina, who was also dealing with the same issues John Steinbeck was raising in his works, and unfortunately, according to my modest knowledge, there has been no comparison between Hanna Mina and John Steinbeck in terms of comparative literature. This is a huge gap in our syllabi, because comparative literature is not simply taught in Moroccan universities. Muhammad Shukri. Those of you who have read For Bread Alone, and also The Grapes of Wrath, you can perhaps easily find certain affinities. You've seen Grapes of Wrath as a movie, so what can you say? And you've read also For Bread Alone. Mind you that the 2 texts are a little bit different, because apparently Muhammad Shukri, according to him, he was writing an autobiography, something about his life, whereas John Steinbeck was concerned with community. So what is, according to you, what can relate Mohammed Shukri and John Steinbeck?
Maybe the themes of...
Yeah, the themes,
yeah,
right?
Like poverty and...
Okay, sure. And hunger.
Yeah, and hunger, of course.
Because
That's
Muhammad...
poverty.
Yes, hunger not only as something we feel, but as a metaphor in both the Grapes of Wrath and Mohammed Shukri's For Bread Alone. Now, what is also interesting is this displacement of the two families. As you know, Muhammad is being displaced from the Rif Mountains to Tangiers, and from Tangiers to Tétouan, and from Tétouan to Oran, Wahran in Algeria. So you have this sense of the individual, or perhaps being displaced and lacking a certain kind of identity, a certain sense of belonging, which the work of John Steinbeck can always emphasize. I have already talked about Mohammed Zabzab, but I also added to the list two great Egyptian contemporary authors, Muhammad el-Basati from Egypt, whose book Hunger is also can be also used as a text to relate Arab authors and John Steinbeck, for sure. And then Ala al-Aswani, another Egyptian contemporary novelist. And I would say that Ala al-Aswani, yes, can share so many things with John Steinbeck, but Ala al-Aswani is more or less concerned with forms of corruption in contemporary Egyptian society, and he's also concerned with politics as such. The list can be extended to other authors. Ladies and gentlemen, what we need in the Arab world is maybe research centers on American studies to be able to translate more works from English into Arabic, and to encourage students to conduct research in comparative literature, to always compare Arab authors, and not only John Steinbeck, but also Hemingway, Faulkner, Sinclair Lewis, and Scott Fitzgerald, and the list is long. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom Joad got out of the old McAllister pen. There he got his parole. After 4 long years on a man-killing charge, Tom Joad come a-walking down the road. Poor boy, Tom Joad come a-walking down the road. Tom Joad, he met a truck-driving man. There he caught him a ride. He said, I just got loose from McAllister pen on a charge called homicide. A charge